Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have everyone today for an incredible webinar. We've been hosting multiple webinars on bioregionalism in practice. This is our second webinar called Funding Bioregionalism Practice, Weaving Local Solutions in a Global Context. So today we have a very packed agenda, so we are going to get started pretty quickly. I just want to say thank you to all the speakers and panelists that have joined us today. It's going to be a really fun conversation, and we'll learn a lot. So we're going to actually get started with some breaths. And so if you can all just place your feet on the ground flat and your hands on your lap. Close your eyes. We'll take 3 deep breaths together. Inhaling slowly. Exhaling. Inhaling through your diaphragm. Exhaling out through your nose. And one last breath on your own. Again, thank you all for joining us. We have several incredible speakers here today who will introduce throughout the context of the webinar. We'd love to introduce ourselves. I'm Faith Flanagan. I'm the 360 lead of Regenerosity. I'm joined here by Ruth Andrade, the chair of the Regenerosity board, and Jackie Kearney, our partnership lead for Nurture program, and Renata, who is the co-founder of Be the Earth. And I also say Eva in Eva in our room of faces right here. So I'd love to get started by sharing a little bit about who we are. Renata is going to share about Be the Earth. We'll share a little bit about Regenerosity and the Nurture program, and then we'll kick it off.
Thanks, Faith. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. Thanks for making the time to join us. I'll be brief so we can get to the inspiring conversations about to happen here. My name is Renata. As Faith said, I'm co-founder of Be the Earth. We are a family foundation, which is actually a hybrid organization working with philanthropy, but also impact investing and exploring the whole spectrum of capital. So many different financial models in between to help us move towards a more ecocentric economies. And we work on a trust-based approach, trying to debureaucratize and make grant accessible, support individuals, also give like a blended support to different organizations depending on the stage they're at, so we can leverage everyone's skills and different resources they offer. Our main geographies are Brazil, UK, and South Africa. And we've been very lucky to be partnering with Regenerosity at the Nurture Community of Practice and other things as well. And thanks for coming, and thanks for all the speakers. Look forward to hearing more from you. I'll put the website also on the chat if you want to see a little more about us.
Thank you, Renata. And I can share a little bit. I did want to say we do have a poll, actually. I forgot about the poll. We hadn't talked about it. So we have a poll that we would love to hear from you. I'm going to actually put the poll out right now. And the poll is just telling us who you are and kind of where you come from. If you're a practitioner, a funder, or run a project. So Please take the time to answer the poll to one question, so we'll be pretty quick. And then while you're filling out the poll, I'd love to share a little bit about who we are at Regenerosity. So Regenerosity is a nonprofit that resources grassroots leaders and organizations that are working to restore ecosystems, regenerating food systems, and revitalizing ancestral knowledge. We provide funding and connect the organizations with aligned funders, peer organizations, and platforms for a shared learning and storytelling. We believe that communities collaborating at a bioregional scale are key to addressing the intersecting crises of climate change, social inequality, and environmental degradation, and recognize that traditional philanthropy has often overlooked grassroots organizations and the potential they bring to the field. Regenerosity was founded to address this gap and promotes a new approach to philanthropy that's both trust-based, community-centered, and focused on long-term bioregional impact. We see ourselves as a living bridge through our grant making, capacity building, and shared stories, and work at the intersection of shifting livelihoods, increasing biodiversity, creating food sovereignty, and building resilience from the ground up. This webinar is one of our kind of offerings through the Nurture program. And I would love to share a little bit more. Actually, Jackie would love to share a little bit more about the Nurture program. So I'm going to spotlight you, Jackie.
Hi, everyone. Great to be with you this morning or this evening, wherever you're calling from. So we've just heard from Faith and Renata about Be the Earth and Regenerosity. This webinar is being held and facilitated by the Nurture Funder Community of Practice, which has been stewarded by Be the Earth and Regenerosity over the past 4 years. It's a global network of funders committed to putting trust-based and regenerative principles into action. So we bring together aligned wealth holders, foundation staff, philanthropic advisors, and intermediaries who want to reimagine how capital flows in ways that are more equitable, responsive, and rooted in relationships. So really kind of rooted in our ethics. As a community, we embrace a collaborative and learning by doing approach. We host retreats, webinars like this, community calls and case clinics, and we collaborate on pooled funds to support each other in practice and growing and evolving our practices. So if you're joining us and maybe hearing about us from the first time, if you're a funder, part of a foundation, and you're not yet part of this community, and you're looking for space to connect, to learn, to reflect, and take action with aligned peers, then we warmly welcome you to join. And I'll just put a link in the chat where you can find out more and register your interest and get in touch with us. So welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Jackie. And we'd love to hand it over to you, Ruth.
Thank you. It helps if I unmute myself. Hello, everyone. My name is Ruth Andrade. I have tended to facilitate these webinars, and today is the second webinar in our bioregioning series, and we're going to talk about funding and philanthropy and the role of philanthropy within this movement and in support of this movement. And you're probably here because there is so much currently being talked about bioregioning, bioregional work, bioregionalism, and how working collaboratively and regeneratively, oh, that's really hard, within the ecological and cultural boundaries can support us in not only develop a sense of belonging for place, but also build resilience. And that is an amazing response to social fragmentation that we're seeing really accelerated by AI and social media and climate and the ecological crisis. But it's not just that. It's about helping communities to increase the understanding of their story, of the ecology of their watersheds, and help build these relationships that have sustained life for since the beginning of times, right? Since life started from community. Life is a community. So how can we support those communities steward these relationships and become really active participants in regeneration? And the key thing about this is that what we're trying to do is to support flourishing living systems. And the way that we approach funding and the way that our economic model works, the way that capitalism works, is really far removed from basic principles of living systems. So how do we actually align the flow of finances into these really wonderful initiatives from a perspective of living systems? And I think to contribute to that discussion today, I always say that we do webinars just because I want to talk to Faith and the people at Regenerosity and Renata. We want to talk to cool people, and we kind of let everyone else here come and watch the conversations that we want to have also to move and inform our work. So this is definitely one of those cases. We really have an amazing group of people, and I love to start. So the way we're going to flow today, start with 2 short presentations and then go into a panel. And the first presentation, I'd love to invite Jenny Anderson. Jenny is someone that I really admired. I've been following her work for a really long time. She's the founder of Really Regenerative, and with this core inquiry of what it is to be really regenerative. And it's a community interest company designing learning journeys in regenerative design, hosting inquiries into place, supporting place-based organizations at different, levels of the fractal, of the nested wholes that form from neighborhoods into bioregions, with a lot of experience in international development, communications, and regenerative design. And the reason why we wanted to have her here is that she's been involved in researching and publishing 2 really cool reports on place-based regeneration funded by Joseph Rowan Tree Foundation. And she's here today to share with us the highlights of the report. So Jenny, without further ado, I'd love to invite you to, give us the highlights of, I think you interviewed so many groups and so many initiatives and tried to condense a lot of learning and this diversity and complexity into some really important information that I think is great for us to kickstart this conversation. Thank you.
Ruth, thank you. And huge thanks to Regenerosity, Be the Earth and the Nurture Funder community for hosting this conversation. And it's lovely to see so many friends in the room and so many people that were actually part of this research and contributed to it. I'm going to share my screen to talk you through this. I've got to be precise. I have been given a short amount of time to deliver some of the key findings from the first piece of research that Joseph Rowntree Foundation commissioned us to do last year. So it's going to be a bit of a rapid ride, but hopefully there'll be time later if you'd like to ask me some questions about it. So let me just check. Can you all see my screen? Okay. So the first report that we produced during the course of last year and launched earlier this year was really to explore what might be the enabling conditions for place-based community-led regeneration and what role should philanthropic funding play. And we were really asked to look outside the UK, at other territories around the world, to hold conversations, both individual and group, with organisations that seem to be doing really interesting and cutting edge work across the fractals of place, but mainly interested in the emerging the bioregional movement. So there were 2 really key questions that we were trying to explore and answer. The first and the main one was what conditions and capacities enable communities to steward regenerative transformation of their places, but critically at the level, longevity and depth that the polycrisis is asking us to engage with. And how, as a philanthropic organisation like Joseph Rowntree Foundation, play the most transformative and catalytic role. And I guess some of you may have heard this quote from Ilya I'm never quite sure how to pronounce this name, so I'm bound to say it wrong. Prigogine, or I'm not sure. Anyway, we know who we're talking about, who talked about islands of coherence. And we were looking for patterns that might enable philanthropic funders to invest money perhaps more coherently and more consistently across those emerging patterns. So the first pattern that we saw is something that we described as centers for life, as being essential. What are centers for life? They can be social movements, they can be communities or activities, lighthouse demonstrators of future potential. They're things that anchor dialogue, experimentation, innovation, possibility, and nurture the needed qualities like courage, collaboration, shifts in perception. So if we think about the cafes of the Enlightenment period in the UK, they would have been centres for life, holding that energy for transformative change. Folk schools in the Nordic countries that help transform rural poor agriculture communities into social democracies during the 20th century, or even things like the Baptist churches that supported the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King, to which vast chunks of people moved in and out of all the time to restore, regenerate, discuss, evolve and move the civil rights movement on. So they hold transformative energy. And we saw lots of different kinds of these emerging. Bioregional learning centres and communities, such as we have in the UK, in Devon, in Scotland, and more are emerging all the time, like the bioregional weaving labs in Europe, some fantastic bioregional movements led by people like Joe Brewer in Cascadia. There are really enormous amounts of these emerging at the moment, and the whole bioregional movement itself is like a centre for life. But they could also be regenerative innovation centres that are trying to support place-based enterprise. They could be cultural learning centres and even field building between diverse social movements. So to give you a sort of concrete example of what one of those might look like, in the south of France, in the Camargue, is an amazing philanthropically funded experiment called Atelier Luma, which has been funded for 12 years now to transform a former derelict place that where railway engines used to be built, to bring innovative thinkers, designers, producers to work on the natural materials and the biomaterials of the Camargue, and so create a new transformative economy in that place. Another example in Australia would be something like Regen Labs, who we also spoke to at length and who were partners with us in this research, who are trying to create a new ecosystem of enterprises that are going to support the shift towards regeneration. So it probably won't come as too much of a surprise that one of our core recommendations to funders was to invest in and develop centres for life, whether they would be biomaterials-based economic development, marine regeneration, cultural regeneration, bioregional learning centres, food systems regeneration, or even within the built environment, that funders should look at the potential for these types of social movements and place-based anchor institutions, that not institutions is the wrong word, that could be created that would support and hold and create real live examples that people could connect with and understand of the kind of regenerative future we are trying to bring to life. And some of the opportunities that we identified in the UK were perhaps to partner with existing centres like museums, like private estates, national parks, and even mayoral development authorities that could be invested in and supported to develop this kind of work. So the second pillar that we talked about with Joseph Rowntree Foundation was really place readiness. And that's another word for cultural scaffolding. That in every single place in which we wanted to bring a bioregional movement into being, not all places would have the same degree of readiness for this work as others. So if I were to compare in the UK, for example, where I live in Sussex, and I think I did see Isabel earlier, to Devon, for example, where there is a very thriving bioregional movement, that has been, I think, helped and scaffolded by having Schumacher College there, by having the Transition Town movement burst from there. So one of the things that was very important to think about and understand for bioregional designers and practitioners was to really try to understand the degree of readiness or cultural scaffolding that would be needed. So a second recommendation was to ask philanthropic funders to invest in building more cultural scaffolding across lots of different areas of investment, which could be from building political will to investing in critical moments that might enable systems change, to investing in narrative capacity, and supporting a deeper understanding of how long-term transformative change actually really happens. The third pillar was really looking at capabilities and qualities, which we expanded more in the second report. And we could see that there are widespread capabilities for regenerative design and development, but there were also some significant gaps. And some of the gaps that we looked at and saw and understood were particularly around the ability to be highly relational and collaborative, but also in some instances, and this was different in every place and geography that we spoke to, a much deeper ecological knowledge and understanding, pattern literacy, the capacity to design for systems evolution, to really understand how to find those nodes and acupuncture points in living systems, which could be the focus of investment. So that was really also a really critical ask, to invest more in building the capabilities and skills and qualities that are needed to do this transformative work over a long time. The fourth pillar was the importance of place-centric individuals and organisations. And we diversely describe them as weavers of future potential. Sometimes they are educators, conveners, innovators, acting as lighthouses themselves. Another way of describing them would be to use John P. Lederach's wonderful phrase, critical yeast. Those individuals that are almost always right on the edges of systems, experimenting with transformative change, who are significantly underfunded and supported by philanthropic organisations. And also the importance of recognising that the role for those key individuals would transmute and transform over time to the ecosystems, the networks and ecosystems that those individuals would be bringing into being. I think Joe Brewer, I think I saw you earlier in the cohort, has also been talking about that in a different way, how we move from supporting those individuals into supporting the collective ecosystems of work, whether they are bioregional or they might be in the built environment, that they are bringing together and creating across geographies and across different fields of work. But those individuals are really important and need support at the scale and longevity it takes, sometimes at least 10 years. The final pillar that we looked at was really the importance of developmental and relational work as absolutely critical. So what do I mean by that? It is the work that builds the transformative mindset, that builds the embodied sense that I'm sure Domingo can speak to much more eloquently than I can later. But it's really engaging at the edges where emergent thinking interfaces with the dominant paradigm that we're all working within, and building the relational capacity across different paradigms of thinking, different cultures, different personalities, different lived experiences, and critically also trauma-related work. So healing effectively the story of separation that we are all living within, whether that's a separation between humans and nature and humans that manifests in so many different ways. So the final recommendation was really to strengthen and democratize access to regenerative learning and practice. One of the things that showed up consistently was how hard it is for organizations who are focused on learning and development and regenerative practice to access funding themselves. There seemed to be a general perception that those are organizations that can self-fund, and often that does not necessarily democratize access to learning across all different fields in our communities and in our societies. There were a couple of more. I've got one, like 30 seconds, and then I must stop. To really move from drip feeding, funding short-term projects, to flow feeding. So to move from sticking plaster funding to systemic funding, to move from short-term to long-term funding, to really invest in the consciousness development of human evolution, place-based regenerative innovation culture, whilst transforming the critical life support systems and human economic and cultural systems that we are within. And also to build the capability, ambition, and the understanding gap that was really prevalent between philanthropy and investors and those place-based community-led regeneration groups and projects that are starting to emerge. And I'm going to stop there because I've gone 20 seconds over my time.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, we'll have some time in the panel to actually go deeper into the conversation. But thank you so much. It's such a refreshing piece of work that brings all the important elements so concisely explained and in a way that we can actually make sense of the work, right? So yeah, thank you so much, Jenny, for that. And I think for me, the critical E's, and I can see as I look into who is on this call, there are so many of those critical E's here and so many people connected to Centers of Life, Centers for Life as well. It's pretty incredible how, the networks are there, the people are there. How do we actually move into flow, as you mentioned there? And, as you say, like moving from this pattern recognition and the sense making into what does that look like in practice when we take those practices onto the ground. I'd love to invite Atosa and Domingo from the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Alliance that are going to share a bit with us what that looks like in practice. And one of the really established bioregional initiatives that I really admire, the ASHA, or the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Alliance, is a collaboration of 30 indigenous nations and partner organizations in Ecuador and Peru, aiming to permanently protect 86 million acres of Amazonian rainforest from deforestation and extractive industries. It was founded in 2017, and it's an indigenous-led initiative promoting solutions inspired by indigenous wisdom. And I think bringing indigenous wisdom to this movement is key. As we said before, that having, as Jenny, as you said, having the cultural scaffolding, right, that indigenous culture can, share with us is, I think, really important. And they have an amazing bioregional plan for 2030 that I really recommend folks to read. So I'll give the mic to Domingo and Atosa Sani, who's the global strategy for Amazon Sacred Headwaters, and Uyuncar Domingo, who is the president of ASHA. Thank you so much. And as you know, Spanish and English, if you've been here before, you'll get a little messy, but I'm sure we can work it out. Atosa, I'm a big fan of your work. And it's so amazing to have you both here share. What can we learn from, relationality and connection as we do this work on Indigenous wisdom? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That's such an honor to be here. I want to first ask Domingo Peas, who's actually listening to the translation in real time, to start to tell the story of the Sacred Headwaters. I've known Domingo since 2000, and he's one of the greatest Indigenous leaders alive today, organizing Indigenous peoples across borders and throughout the Amazon. Domingo. Y yo voy a traducir entonces en cortas frases, por favor.
Una vez más, muy buenos días. Muchas gracias por este gran encuentro. Saludar de pueblos, 30 pueblos indígenas de la Amazonía peruana ecuatoriana.
Thank you so much again for this great meeting and this opportunity to speak to you. I want to greet you on behalf of the 30 indigenous peoples of the headwaters region of Ecuador and Peru.
Quería felicitar a la Jenny por su gran presentación y también agradecer y a todas las mujeres que están aquí presentes por gran intención que la humanidad necesita. Es hora de sentar a conversar.
I want to thank Jenny and congratulate her for this great report that she just shared, and also to thank and congratulate all of the women present on this call. The time is now for women and their great intentions for the planet. We need their leadership.
Voy a ser rápido por el tiempo. Cuencas Sagradas nace de experiencia de la vida. Yo estoy trabajando 33 años en proceso organizativo indígena y he escuchado las resoluciones de los pueblos indígenas de toda la Amazonía, que siempre han dicho que la Amazonía es ser vivo, tenemos que cuidar, somos parte de la Amazonía, somos Amazonía, y por lo tanto tenemos que cuidarnos siempre toda la vida para protección permanente, para la conservación y defensa a este ser vivo. Es por esa resolución de todas las veces nace esta gran alianza Cuencas Sagradas, que está conformada entre indígenas de Ecuador y Perú.
So, how the Sacred Headwaters was born? It was born from our life experience. I have been working for 33 years in organizing indigenous movements, and what I've seen is that throughout the Amazon, there have been repeated resolutions that call for the protection of the Amazon. Of course, the Amazon for us is a living entity, is a living being. We are part of the Amazon. We are the Amazon, and we have to protect permanently the forests, the ecosystems. We have to defend the life that's there because we're defending this living entity. So all of these indigenous resolutions were part of what helped to give birth to this great alliance, which are 30 nations across Ecuador and northern Peru, mostly indigenous lands.
Entonces, este compromiso de cuidado, protección permanente es 35 millones de hectáreas, donde estamos nosotros. Todo este espacio aún es selva intacta, aún es ser vivo. Lo más importante de este trabajo, por trayectoria de trabajo, he ganado una confianza de los indígenas y también de no indígenas. Eso es lo más importante. Por eso, primerito era alianza entre indígenas. Segundo fase era alianza con los indígenas, porque sabemos que la realidad solo indígenas, hablando entre nosotros, no llegamos con mensaje nuestro al mundo. Entonces, con una alianza de puente, como Atosa, como Belén, como Bill y otras personas que ahora están con nosotros, ahora ustedes, es una manera de llegar con nuestra propuesta de interés colectivo. Eso es lo más importante que yo estoy encabezando para este gran trabajo.
So first, we committed. Indigenous peoples have made a firm commitment to defend an area that's 35 million hectares. And this is mostly intact forest. She is a living entity. We have first began to build confidence internally. First among Indigenous peoples, we made this commitment, but then we realized that Indigenous people by themselves are not going to be able to get their message out, that we're not going to be effective alone, that we needed to form partnerships with non-Indigenous. And that's where we had relationships of trust, of decades of trust with people like who were bridges for us, like Atosa, Bill, Belen, and many others, and now all of you. And just to say that we are working to protect this forest, it isn't just for the indigenous, it's for the collective interest of all humanity.
Entonces, para este trabajo, nosotros hemos apuntado, tengo 2 minutos, hemos apuntado en 3 cosas. Uno es fortalecimiento organizativo para que las organizaciones sigan defendiendo su territorio con acción de protección legal. Hemos apoyado en esto. El más importante es compromiso total de todos los indígenas seguir cuidando este bosque primario. 3, crear educación, crear conciencia. Es importantísimo. Hemos creado una escuela viva amazónica, liderando 60 ya formados hombres y mujeres para empoderar gobernanza territorial indígena. Mente sana, limpia de corazón para que el trabajo sea con armonía. Lo otro importante también, ahora estamos entrando para crear confianza, es justo, eso va a hablar a Tosa. Hay mucha demanda en territorio indígena por la globalización que tenemos ahora. Nos toca mover, haciendo urgentemente programas de soberanía alimentaria, bioeconomía, restauración, reforestación. Es el punto número 1 que queremos cambiar el sistema de trabajo para que sigamos cuidando bosque primario intacta.
We started with basically strengthening the institutional capacity of all of the indigenous organizations in the territory. They were committed. They were committed to be, basically protecting and defending their territory. And we needed to commit to helping create, strengthen their capacity. Second is to be able to support legal actions, legal strategies that help indigenous people defend their rights, defend their territories. And the third strategy was to basically generate consciousness, ecological consciousness and leadership. And so we have begun a school, a leadership school. So far, 60 people have graduated. Another 60 are in course right now, a year-long program. And it's basically to teach leadership that's with, mind and heart that's committed. And then the third, the last strategy that we're in now that Atosa will speak to is there's so much need in the territories that we have to, globalization has reached these territories. And so there's a need for programs for alternative livelihoods, food sovereignty, reforestation, conservation, restoration. We have to be able to reach these territories with programs that allow the indigenous people to continue to protect and defend their territories.
Entonces, para llegar a ese punto, va a hablar ahora Tosa, estamos proponiendo este fondo bioregional. Esto es clave porque no hay confianza con las ONGs, con empresarios, inversionistas, no hay confianza. Entonces queremos crear confianza, sanar mente para todos, porque todos tenemos que aprender. Para que este cambio, es verdad lo que dice Jenny, no es solamente 10, yo diría más, yo proyecto el instituto que estamos creando para educar a la juventud. La próxima gobernanza está apuntando después de 30 años, pero ya estamos arrancando. Tenemos que crear urgentemente una confianza entre los indígenas, no indígenas, gobierno, empresas, inversionistas. Indígenas, no indígenas. Tenemos que crear Eso es el programa que estamos lanzando, este plan, Fondo Bioregional. Eso va a explicar más a Tosa, cuestión de idioma. Quiero agradecer por este tiempo. Quieren preguntarme de la selva, yo estoy listo. De la tecnología está Tosa y otro equipo más, ¿sí? Muchas gracias por vuestro tiempo.
Gracias, Domingo. So, the last thing I will say is, as I wrap up, is that Tosa will speak to the need to create a bioregional fund, a bioregional vehicle that allows funding to get down to the ground, because there's a gap, there's a huge gap, and most of that is due to the fact that there's no trust. There's no confidence between the indigenous and the non-indigenous. We all have to heal our minds and deal with our own learning. We all have to commit to learning what we need to be and how we need to be now for the work that is within all of us to do. And that's why we're, created the leadership school. Eventually, we want to create an institute, almost a learning institute, like a university, that is basically bringing the indigenous and the modern world, knowledge systems together. And really what we need, I think our biggest challenge is to build trust between indigenous peoples, even good people in the governments, the companies, investors. We need to create consciousness and confidence. And that's the message I leave you. If you need to know anything about the forest, ask me. If you want the technical details, ask Atosa. We're working together. Thank you so much for this time.
Thank you, Domingo.
And now I'll just say it's an honor to be in this role of a global navigator for the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Alliance. I personally, came from a journey of starting Amazon Watch and being the director for many years, and now have dedicated the last 7 years in helping navigate an indigenous-led alliance that's working to protect the headwaters. And I just want to say that so much of the story has to do, and please give me a 2-minute warning, okay, Ruth? Thank you. So much of the story has to do with the fact that for decades, indigenous peoples of Ecuador and Peru were separated by an artificial border during a war. And after, between the 40s and the mid-90s, they were cut off. Indigenous families, the same indigenous nations, were separated by this artificial border. That's the story of place. And that when we did an analysis in the bioregional planning process, which was a participatory process that took about 3.5 years, we realized that, these 80% of the bioregion of the sacred headwaters, the headwaters of the Amazon River, were under threat by government's plans to expand logging, mining, agriculture, petroleum development, pipelines, roads. And that we came together at one moment and said, we've actually had a lot of victories, one place at a time, but that's not going to address the onslaught of threats that we are now facing. If we project the future, we did a lot of scenario analysis looking at what was coming. And the indigenous people said, look, we are, our cosmology as people who survived this incredible forest over millennia. The Domingo's people, the Achuar, date back somewhere around 10 to 13,000 years. The reason we survived is we formed alliances with the both visible and the non-visible, with the spirit of the forest, with the animals. We were all kin. We were all part of the life force of this forest, and the forest is alive and guiding us. So many of the leaders came together and said, we need to unite our disparate fights into one big fight for the entire region, because obviously when you live in the Amazon, already there are patterns of river basin. Most of the federations, most of the indigenous nations are organized around river basins, upriver, downriver. And if you allow one development, oil drilling or mining upstream, you're going to poison the people downstream. So it was a very logical and, I would say, informed by spirit, informed through ceremony, and informed through logic and existing patterns. The alliances emerged. I'll show a few slides just to give people a sense of where we are. I will share this PowerPoint later so you can, be able to access it. Let me just redo this.
And then Atosa will have more time in the panel as well.
Yeah. So just a few slides to show people where we are. obviously people know the Amazon basin is, under a tipping point of no return. We are in this part of the Amazon where the glaciers begin, the big glaciers in Ecuador, and then going downstream to where Iquitos, where you see for the first time the Amazon River on the map. As I said, there's 30 indigenous nations. These are many of them have been living traditionally for millennia, 700,000 people. And when we started to draw the boundaries of what the bioregion was, it was much smaller. And as we organized and more organizations, regional organizations got involved, the boundaries grew. First, they were the watershed boundaries, but then people said, look, the watershed is doesn't reflect the cultural map. They're indigenous territories that, that cross both rivers, that cross various river basins. And so the map grew, and now we are holding this area with a bit of humility because it's massive. It's the size of Italy. And we have also been, encouraged to grow. But really the principle of the strategies to organize along existing patterns, along river basins. So just to say that we have the bioregional plan as our guiding light. It is basically attempting to address deforestation, support well-being of communities, transition. The whole frame is ecological transition to a life-centered, model instead of a life-blind economic model, a life-seeing and life-affirming economic model. That's basically putting indigenous stewardship at the core. And so we are learning a lot. I think one of the big challenges, it's now indigenous led. We have many structures in Switzerland, in the US, in Ecuador, in Peru, to be able to get money to the ground, because one of the key challenges is getting funding to the territory.
Yeah.
And I think that, I think my time is up, but just to give you a slide of what is our focus. Our priorities are securing indigenous rights, advancing well-being, actually growing our alliances and our collective power of advocacy and collective ability to change policy, and then strengthen our own governance, coordination, and learning so we can be regenerative. And then, really mobile. And now the Bioregional Fund is our vision for a fund that is able to make over 10 million in annual regrants to the territories. Wow, priorities. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry, it's a little.
That's all good.
We'll come back to the.
Yeah, I think we can continue exactly where you left off in terms of funding, like how, and I think the conversation now in the panel is bioregional work needs consistent long-term funding. It's it's really interesting because in the grand scheme of the amount of fund that flows in the world is such little money. But I was just reading today, I was preparing something for lunch, and I was reading that to halt extinction, basically, we only need 3.6% of fossil fuel subsidies. It's nothing. It's like little money to protect the areas that have the highest species rarity. So we just need to figure out, by sitting together, funders and the movements, how do we create the infrastructure? What is needed in order to be able to flow money that's already there in investment and philanthropy? And to be part of this conversation, I'd love to bring Jenny back to the panel, but also introduce Urvi Kelkar from Joseph Rowan Tree Foundation, and then Alex Wilkins from the Cisco Climate Commitment. She's a grant manager there. Urvi is part of the Emerging Futures team at JRF, and she has led a major program of work focusing on resourcing organizations working to build a just and regenerative future in the UK. She's a strategist, facilitator, change designer, and somatic practitioner, weaving external and inner change. And Alex is the grant manager at Cisco Climate Commitment for the Cisco Foundation and the Chief Sustainability Officer. And through strategic funding, Alex supports organizations that are working towards climate resiliency in vulnerable communities worldwide, with a large background in leading strategic programs and partnerships for nonprofits. So yeah, I'd love to bring the funders into this conversation, which together, with all of us here to try to get to this question, how do we just open the gates of capital towards life, right? Towards supporting living structures in ways that really restore, repair, regenerate, and protect, rather than create more harm and competition. I think that's, the challenge that we have now. And I'd love to start by, framing this, and I'm going to ask a question to Urvi to begin with. Like, why is this important from a funder's perspective? Why is it important to fund bioregionalism? And how can that look like in practice? What does funding bioregionalism, bioregioning, collective place-based impact, how does that work on the ground? I'll start with Urvi and then I'll ask Alex as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's really lovely to be here. Over the weekend, I was listening to a podcast by an amazing facilitator and researcher in Australia called Leah Aveni, and she put it really simply. She said, colonization is the violent imposition of boundaries between our bodies and ecosystems around us that creates separation in all directions, right? And nation states are one manifestation of that. But I think this principle of separation and what it means to operate out of separation and out of wholeness is, I think, large part of the inquiry I've been holding over since 2023. Within JRF, I've been part of the Emerging Futures team and leading specifically a program of work that was about, let's just experiment. We're not going to figure this out intellectually. Let's just experiment with resourcing organizations. JRF, for people who don't know, is very much a UK-based foundation, and it was created by Joseph Rowntree about 120 years ago, who really had an interest in sort of resourcing work that was about addressing deeper structural root causes rather than the more superficial manifestations or symptoms. And so we've, over the last few years, resourced, I would say, some work that's been explicitly bioregional, like the Bioregional Learning Centre in South Devon, like the work of Opus in Sheffield, who are very much doing systems change demonstrators at a city level, but then also looking at the bioregion surrounding the city, particularly the catchment area of the River Don. So some of the work's been like that. But quite a lot of the work, I would say, that we've resourced has not been explicitly bioregional, but it's been following similar patterns and processes of people and organizations who are deeply rooted in place and have a commitment to holding these long-term visions and transformation processes in place, and are working intersectionally across many different thematic areas: social, ecological, cultural, and so on. And I guess a couple of things informed our approach, in the sense of, one, knowing that philanthropy's traditional toolkit it's just not fit for purpose. And second, we commissioned Onion Collective to do some research because we wanted to know how much of current funding actually flows into future building work. And that research found it was about 2%. So this is, again, UK context, but 2% of annual UK grant giving goes into work that's not even explicitly bioregional. That's just work about building alternatives to the current system rather than optimizing the current system. So it's tiny, tiny, tiny. And so just a few examples of things we've experimented with. It was more, I would say, in terms of the practice of grant making or funding. We experimented with just moving quite quickly, using trusted relationships within the team to identify organizations, and then offering core funding, taking the organization on a journey of starting to shift our timelines. Last year was the first year we shifted to 5-year budgets rather than annual, and there's still a long way to go. Also taking a very relational rather than transactional approach. And I would say it was as much about the posture as the practice, like really being intentional about what posture we're holding. Can we show up as in a spirit of partnership, with humility, with listening, but also accountability and awareness of the scale of the crisis. And then the last thing I want to just bring in is, I think a lot of conversations within philanthropy are very like externally centered, like how do we fund the change as if it's out there, whereas of course a lot of the work that needs to happen is really internal within philanthropic institutions. So like the JRF trustees have been on quite a journey of like quite a challenging journey, I would say, a learning and unlearning journey about like starting to reckon with what it means to be a trustee in these times, and how do we hold terms such as risk and fiduciary duty and compliance? How do we not just see them as barriers, but also bring some imagination and creativity to how those things are interpreted, not as gatekeepers, but rather to assist more in the flow of capital? And then I would say not just at the trustee layer, but also at the whole organizational level. You know, we've learned a lot about the kinds of skills and capacities Jenny was talking about in her session around the capacities for relational work, for thinking in systems, for grappling with conflict and power and complexity. These are all skills that you need within philanthropic institutions also. And that's new. That hasn't been the sort of traditional profile. And then lastly, it's not just about the philanthropic budgets, it's also about the endowments, but maybe we're going to get into that later. So
yes, please. Let's get into that later. Yeah. And Alex, I think, yeah, first of all, it's always so rewarding to hear, funders talking about how they've been doing the inner work, both at the organizational level and then personally, whether it's the founders or the high net worth individuals or the trustees. I think that's super important. And it's important to have more and more examples of that, being shared. And Alex, when we were preparing for this, we were also discussing a little bit the role of philanthropy in this whole movement, right? So we know that philanthropy alone is not enough, but philanthropy can have a very important role. So I'd love to hear from you, like what role do you see yourselves playing in this, in this world, in this field? And then I think we'll open the discussion a bit of how do we go beyond philanthropy as well later on.
Yeah. I first just, Ruth and team, congratulations on the diversity and the breadth of the types of organizations that you have invited to this webinar. I think, Irvi, there's so much that I have already sort of started to internalize from what you are saying. And so I think it is that like reciprocity of just, how do we talk to each other better? Because Cisco Foundation really quite different in how we do things and how we approach everything. Like, I think that there are a lot of other philanthropic supporters, advisors, weavers in this specific room. I think I saw at least like 16 in the poll that you took. Nice. And I think that everybody, like every institution, right, has their own unique roles to play. I'm specifically representing Cisco with our own unique design constraints, certainly representing the world of like corporate tech philanthropic funders. And so like I said, like certainly much to learn from Regenerosity, but also I think things to signal and to whether that's other tech entities. I'm based here in the Silicon Valley area. I do think though, perhaps philanthropy and how I've been thinking about philanthropy as transitional capital, right? So one early option within a broader mosaic of capital. I think, again, I'm close to San Francisco. You'll hear capital stack a lot. But really that patchwork or that tapestry of different types of funding that is not just drip funding, but that flow funding. And so how is it multiple flows embedded into a bioregion, a place-based solution, a program, a community? And I think to move beyond pure reliance of philanthropic funding, I think part of our work is to fund those enabling conditions, right? I think, Ginny, you mentioned this systemic funding. So governance, connectivity. Full disclosure, we fund the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Alliance. It's been a beautiful partnership for, Atosa, predating my tenure at Cisco, so at least 2 or 3 years. And so really funding, right, the technical solutions at Cisco. We love, right, how is technology the role, but really that governance, that connectivity, that trust building that's needed, to have those enabling conditions, right, to do all of the other things that philanthropy is not set up to do. I will say that, yeah, go ahead.
So I'll just riff off one thing and then you can continue. But I think because funding at a bioregional level, there's so many opportunities, right? So identifying the right funders. So if Cisco is more interested in, the technical solutions and the connectivity and the monitoring, it's creating that mosaic, as you mentioned, and it means everyone can play a part, because it doesn't matter. All of it, like the full stack is needed, and all different kinds of funders are needed, right? So it's how do you help people be part of that story, I think is what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I don't know, Ruth, if we're getting into this later, if we have time, but I may just say now, right? Recently, I've been doing a lot of thinking or work in relationship, right, with scientific experts, finance experts, indigenous experts themselves, helping me identify the gaps where Cisco's specific portfolio can really, right, whether it's technology, whether it's, supporting some innovation of local entrepreneurs, right, whatever and, I put the link in the chat. You can go and see what are our specific design constraints, right? But, right, so that inflection point for my own portfolio that I'm responsible for stewarding, but also how do we all and all of the other philanthropic funders in this room, how are we all not identifying our gaps on our own? And how can we make sure that we're talking about, I am this particular color of thread and this particular tapestry. I myself am an embroidery stitcher, so all of my metaphors are always like weaving and embroidery.
I love this.
Tapestry. I will say just a couple other things. There's just so much to say and never enough time. I think the work that I support is entirely cash grant philanthropic in nature. But we have worked with our partners to identify alternative flows of funding, whether that's from other philanthropic support, which is where our conversation has gone so far, but perhaps also from public entities or bioeconomies, nature enterprises, innovative flows like the work that Quinta Sagradas, Amazon Sacred Headwaters, is doing with Jaguar credits. Domingo, you have some excellent thought, like thinking and leadership behind that. And then the bioregional financing facilities, right, that Atosa is mentioning. I'll say just quickly one other example from our portfolio. And I know one of the questions is sort of what gets us excited or what types of funding. I wouldn't necessarily say that this is a bioregional effort. Like Urvi, we also have, it's not explicitly exclusively bioregional funding. But one of our funded programs is to convene farmers, particularly BIPOC landholders here in the United States in Central Texas on the Brazos Rivershed. They're working to restore their own farmland along banks, which provides downstream flooding, which certainly the city of Houston would have a stake in that conversation, right? And so how can that municipal funding flow literally upstream, combining that with eco credits, whether that's carbon markets, Jaguar eco credits, anything along those lines, funding from the land itself that's connected to local regional markets. Our support of that is to provide that proving ground, right, and build that ground from the ground up, right, on the farm for that intergenerational wealth building. So I think I'll leave it.
That's super interesting. Here in the UK as well, we were trying to, I was trying to support someone in getting funding to just test that, like having philanthropic capital for that risk testing, the creation of municipal bonds, which then, would be self-funding, but having funding to do the initial development, which often, can unlock different kinds of capital later. Like I know everyone's head must be, I would have so much to contribute to this, including mine. But I just want to pick up on something that you said about, we were talking about embroidery and the mosaic or funding and, identifying, having this collective of funders helping to fund bioregionalism. And I think when we were in the prep call, we talked about the importance of funders organizing themselves as well to, remove the work from the grassroots or the community initiatives. Atos, I'd love for you to maybe, this question wasn't in our plan necessarily, for you to talk about how have you been stewarding the funders when it comes to funding Amazon Sacred Headwater? Like, are you, have you been able to facilitate the funder collaborative? Yeah, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts around, that collaboration, funder to funder collaboration.
Well, it's our vision to do a lot more than that we have been doing. But I think one thing that's really helped is when funders are curious, Domingo has invited them to the forest to see the communities and the leadership of the Sacred Headwaters Alliance, to be in communication with each other, with the forest, with the communities, to really bring the experiential learning that comes from seeing and feeling and sensing from place. And I think that's been a real gift. I think, to mention one of our funders, Jessica Swayden, she's also helped host webinars for us, for donors. She's come down there. She actually, Synchronicity Earth was one of the first people to believe in the leadership school, heard Domingo's vision and gave us the initial funding to start the school. And then we were able to bring others and create funder circles. So in the UK, we have a funder circle. We're creating one in other places. But I think that I want to just make a pitch to say we want funders to also connect to bioregions and be a key player and self-organize in support of bioregions. So it'd be great, to grow the network of bioregional, donor collaboratives, because it is a lot of work for the people on the ground, especially Amazon, to maintain all of these relationships. But it's really taken our existing funders to really go to others and say, look, this is worthwhile. And I think that's also a role that funders can be mobilizers. And again, the whole concept should be that to bring capital rooted into place as one of the transformative, forces of seeing these long-term bioregional strategies.
Yeah, that's amazing. And Jessica is amazing at that. Like, if people here don't know Synchronicity, they fund the infrastructure of the organization and then help mobilize additional funding. But, that idea of funders taking this very active role in bringing along the collective, right, in order to be able to fund those funders. And Jenny, I also wanted to ask you about, I think in your research, you must have seen so many different types and examples of how things are being funded. I'd love for you to share some of the things that, you mentioned already some in your presentation, but what are the most innovative ways that you've seen philanthropy being used, in this space?
Gosh, there were so many. And I suppose I'll come back to the example of Atelier Luma in Arles, because it was quite a unique example where a single philanthropic individual who had a relationship to that place, who also happened to run a global business in pharmaceuticals, so had a huge amount of funding to draw on, put significant funds and money into that place to really support its economic, ecological and cultural transformation. And that, to me, we saw lots of projects where there was investment in transformation of ecology, or more oriented towards city, where there's transformation of urban environments, but very few funders in the space and very few projects in the space that were able to weave ecology, economy and culture together. And that was one of the messages that was really coming from private investors, from philanthropic organizations and large international funds, is they wanted to see more of those kind of projects on the ground that they could invest in, because they were ready to invest in systemic change. One of the more interesting ones, I think, was WWF in Australia. And there is a kind of idea of never waste a good shock. And Australia had two in succession. So the Black Summer fires of 2019 into 2020 followed very rapidly by the COVID pandemic and had some fairly ferocious lockdowns. But WWF, as an NGO, as a large global NGO, took the opportunity to put some investment into the field to catalyse small explorations and small I suppose, innovations in regenerative design. They weren't huge, but they put them in place that has enabled an entire ecosystem to grow and thrive in Melbourne and Sydney and in other parts of Australia. So funding from sources that you wouldn't necessarily expect is also, I think, worth looking for those institutional organizations that don't necessarily carry with them a regenerative mindset, but have a deep attachment to place, to ecology, to economy or culture. And then I think it's really slow, but it is coming. So large political organizations like the EU Horizon funding, it takes time because they're big, clunky programs. But there's real innovation coming through those large funding programs that's starting to understand the possibility of weaving ecosystems together. One thing that we looked for but didn't see that I think is a really interesting field for philanthropic funding is what is the relationship going to be between cities and the bioregions that they're nested in.
Right.
And that, we looked hard for that, but we didn't find any, particularly. Starting to see it happening in Melbourne now. But I think that is also significant that they have so much support to walk alongside them from Indigenous communities in places like Australia. It makes all the difference in the world. And I think we saw that it gives confidence to funding organizations that there is an additional intelligence brought into the work that they may not understand or may not connect to, but can engage with the sense that different ways of engaging with this work are needed, that are not going to come from their own mindset. Sorry, I'm going for a tangent. So
no, that's beautiful. Yeah. And I think I actually want to go back to that because we have a question in the chat that is about navigating that relationship between, Indigenous wisdom. But just before we move there, I also want to pick up something that Irvi started talking about at the beginning, which is moving beyond philanthropy and the stack of capital. And we know there is a role for philanthropy in this. And I think, Jenny, you brought it so clearly as well. The funding the connective tissue and the centers of life and the net weavers, this is like the invisible threat sometimes, and it's hard to make that work visible and therefore fundable because it's not findable. So I have two questions that I think is probably what we're only going to have time for. One is, how do we make this invisible visible? Because it's so important, the connective tissue, the capacity, the governance capabilities, really that invisible work that's needed. I say invisible, it's not really invisible, but the cultural scaffolding, how do we make that fundable, I think is one question. And to Urvi, I also want to share how do we move beyond philanthropy and actually move the endowment into this work? What's the pathway? And Jenny, you alluded to that. Tulsa, you talked about your bioregional fund for livelihoods that has the bioeconomy. How do we do this? Because philanthropy alone is not going to cut it. So I think we start with that question and then we end with a question of how do we fund the invisible? Yeah. Irvi?
So I think there are a few paths, right? Obviously, spend down foundations has been one path, and that some foundations are going down that route. With JRF, the sort of group, the wider group that JRF is part of, also runs a housing trust and some other things, due to which a pure spend down isn't really feasible. But what the JRF trustees have now committed to is aligning the whole of the endowment with the mission over time. Wow. So this is, when I joined philanthropy, I was quite shocked that the norm is you spend 4 to 5% of your budget on something called grants, and you invest the rest in the capital markets with some like minor ESG filters that don't, like, I was like really shocked that that's the norm. But yeah, so the shift now is going, like, you know, the shift now is like how to align the whole of the endowment with the mission. Someone's just been hired newly onto the team to focus on that, because it's not an easy shift, right? It's not like all of the alternatives are just there, and it's going to involve like new asset classes and like new vehicles, new structures. So I think it's a very ripe area for experimentation. And then I think the other thing we're thinking of, obviously within JERF, is, although we focus on philanthropy because JERF is a philanthropic institution, we're also very aware that a lot of the innovation in this space isn't coming from philanthropy. It's coming from family offices. It's coming from groups like Resource Generation and Resource Justice, who are organizing the next generation of people who are going to inherit wealth. And I think there's a separate, I don't work on this personally, but there's a separate strand of work within JERF that my colleague runs, which is focused on, like, which is called Transforming Wealth Lab, which is basically asking, like, how does philanthropy intersect with wealth holders of other kinds to support this wider movement.
And I think as well, Tosa mentioned the bioregional funding facilities, right? The BFF. In where you are in Cuencas Sagradas, are you designing it so then, you know, for example, foundations would be able to flow some of their endowments, or to be able to take investment and other different parts of the capital stack?
Yes, exactly. The idea is to start with philanthropy, catalytic funding, to build the scaffolding, to build the structures and the pilot programs that then allow bigger funders like the multilaterals, the bilaterals, the investors to come in. We're looking at right now grant making facility first, as well as evolving loan fund for culturally regenerative enterprises led by indigenous and local stewards. And then from those, we're also looking at these idea of tokens, which is a bit, could be crowdfunding, could be corporate funding. It could be basically, what it does is create a universal basic income fund, a sovereign wealth fund at the level of the community, to allow the community to implement its vision for the conservation and restoration of its forests. And those are funded through basically communities' interventions. So the community will do 20 things to protect the forest. Those things are documented, measured, camera traps, etc. And that's the data that we are making available on the blockchain to basically be able to show impact. But really what it is being able to create flows of funding that reach the forest. And then we also look at impact investing. For example, to get to that issuance of tokens for communities conservation and zoning plan, we need, we need investments. We could take impact investments to help generate that, because then some of that can be regenerative. Some of that can continue to generate revenue year after year to help the program perpetuate. I mean, our goal is to get to 20 million hectares through biocultural stewardship units, is what we're calling them. We don't like the word credit, doesn't really work here, but the idea is that you're making interventions, you're making those visible, and then you're finding funders to basically support and back those ecological returns and sometimes financial returns.
That's great. I'll also just mention, put it in the chat. There is an organization in Brazil called Citaui, and they use philanthropic funding to help structure recoverable loans for the bioeconomy, for cooperatives, community-led cooperatives in the forest, with amazing returns, like really amazing returns. And we're oversubscribed when they open that to, investors. So that's also a super interesting way to use philanthropic capital. I put them in the chat, Citaui. Alex, I just want to, I think, what is the learning, maybe some of the learning that you're taking either from this call, or like you're also on this journey, right? As a funder, you're also on this journey of of discovery? And what do you think are good first steps for people that are, going to want to start on this journey like you guys are doing? Yeah.
Yeah, Ruth just saw me like taking notes as Atosa and Irvi are talking. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that so much of it is being in relationship and listening and learning. And I've been doing reading around, right, principles of regenerative economics. There's a lot of amazing authors, even just in this call that I've listened to. And the one that continues to stay with me aside from abundance is that relationship. And so those mutual pathways, like the funding flows that are coming from the work that I steward, but also cautious not to have this sound extractive, right? But what are the gifts that are being received back to me? And a lot of that is learning and understanding and listening. I think a big part of my role is to, one, of course, be a good steward of the funding that I'm responsible for, but also as a storyteller myself. And so one of the things that I didn't mention earlier is Cisco being a relatively well-known, trusted entity with a logo that's recognizable. A lot of our partners, where we start with relatively small cash grants, and then, as Atosa is saying, that early stage sort of catalytic investment that allows larger entities to come in and come join the relationship and come to the table with us. So I love to be able to use our logo and use the diligence that we have already done, the relationships that we've already built. If work and relationship moves at the speed of trust, what can I do?
Yeah.
Build
Amazing.
the trust that I have already built with Atosa, being in relationship for so long. How do we, what is my role in that, of not to accelerate things beyond the time horizons that they need to be, but how can I support this to meet the urgency of what we're facing, right? So I don't know, Ruth, if that really answers your question.
No, that's great. And I think
listening.
I think it's like bringing out the funders, right? And using the fact that we can move in the spaces that groups, organizations can't, to be there, bringing more and more funders into this work and sharing our learnings and our journeys. I think like Irvi shared about JRF, going through this journey, that is so inspirational, right, folks? We have like the last, Jenny, a final word for you. I think that question because there are so many bioregional projects here actually on this call, not projects, initiatives and organizing. What do you think is a piece of advice for supporting making the invisible visible, right? The thread and the connective tissue. And then we'll wrap it up. I know it's a big question that we didn't plan.
I'm not sure I do advice. It's a very dangerous.
Yeah, not advice. I know. We don't do advice. I know, Jenny.
Dangerous space to go.
I know we don't do advice. We come from the same school. We don't do advice. But I think it's like in your experience, then maybe.
Yeah. I hope it's not a diversionary tangent, but I'm going to kind of go there anyway, which is many people on the call may have read the wonderful work of Vanessa Andreotti Machado on hospicing modernity and her more recent book. And I think it's really worth bearing in mind that most funding organizations, most private wealth family organizations, philanthropic organizations, were not born out of a regenerative mindset. They were born out of a globally extractive mindset that accrued vast wealth and then moved into philanthropic effort as a new, more caring mindset arose certainly in Western countries towards the end of the 18th and 19th and 20th century. So there is a journey that those organizations need to commit to, which is a developmental journey. I think that's why the developmental work came up as so important. And there are different types of technologies. When we use the word technology, we tend to think of networks and technical wiry stuff. But the deveiling narratives that help shine a light on the deep underlying structures that hold that culture and that organizational design in place globally, sometimes the developmental frameworks that help people suddenly see the world that they're actually operating in, is one of the first steps that philanthropic and finance organizations take. And one of the things that we saw in the research is that there are a lot of family offices with the funds that they have available that have been on deep systemic learning journeys, and they are ready to invest. And yet, when you really push and ask the question, there's a sneaky desire for a 13, 14, 15% return still. So it takes real deep time and being in relationship and developing those relationships and prioritizing relationship before task. And it takes deep patience of lifetimes beyond certainly my age, which means that we need to develop a better relationship and more intimacy with earth and time than we have. So it's that, yeah, I'd kind of leave it with that.
That's great.
Which around
we have 3 minutes to the end of this call, so I'd like to really thank the panel. Domingo, I don't know if you want to just say a goodbye to everyone. Thank you so much. It's been a really nourishing conversation. I wish we could stay here. So much wisdom in this group. Thank you for your vulnerability and your sharing and your wisdom, and may we stay in connection. And yeah, as you said, Jenny, like, find a different way to relate to time as well in this, times of urgency. And Domingo, I don't know if you want to say goodbye, and then I'll leave it with Faith to share when we meet again. Thank you so much for everyone. Like, it's an amazing group. I wish we could just stay here. Like, we'll resolve all issues just with the people that came today. We can change the world. Thank you. And Domingo, if you want to, just say goodbye so we can hear your voice. And Faith will share a bunch of stuff in the chat, and we will all receive, a post email with all the links to the recording and the presentations. Domingo, bring us home.
Yo quiero agradecer a todas las mujeres y hombres que están aquí, en especial también a Ruth por ser buena moderadora. Lo que quería decirles es que el camino está largo. Tenemos que caminar juntos. Es la única salida. Hombres, mujeres, jóvenes, sabios, sabias, indígenas, no indígenas, ahí está la esperanza. Y todo trabajo tenemos que hacer con amor. Sí, amor a la madre tierra, amor a la naturaleza, amor al ser humano. Eso es lo que hay que cambiar aquí, en cerebro y conectar con corazón. Así es que muchas gracias a todas. Yo estoy muy agradecido.
Gracias, Domingo.
Y a todas. No hay que desanimar. Yo siempre me desanimo, ya no quiero, hay tanto problema.
No se desanime.
A todos dicen, no, hay que tener paciencia. Todos me dicen, tenga paciencia, pues aquí estoy. Entonces, vamos por allá. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
So, just to translate that, Domingo says, thank you to everyone, the men and women who are here. And Ruth, amazing job to you for moderating so well. What I want to share is that the road is long. Our walk together is the key. It's the only way out of our current predicament as humanity faces these crises. We have women, men, business people, young people, elders. We have to come together. We have to walk together. We have to work with love for Mother Earth, love for each other, and love for nature. This is what we need to do to change. And sometimes we get discouraged. Sometimes we lose heart. But we really need to, I'm always reminded, and others remind me, that have patience and stay connected to your heart, stay connected to the earth, and that'll fuel you forward. So let's go. Let's work together.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Till next time.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Urvi and Alex and Atosa, Jenny, Domingo. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, Domingo. Next time I see you, I'll bring some more honey. It was so nice to see you again.
Oh.
Dice que va a traer más miel. Próxima vez que te veo, te va a traer más miel.
Este es mi desayuno especial.
Honey.
¿Recuerdas que ella nos
Gracias.
Well, so many friends on this call. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Raz.